Hello and welcome to A Stitch in Time. Today is Monday, August 13th, 2018, and this is episode 69. My name is Carol and I'm known as Knits and Pearls on Ravelry. The show notes for this and every episode can be found on the blog and also in the episode thread in the Ravelry group. If you'd like to get in touch, you can do so via private message on Ravelry by leaving a comment in the group or by leaving a comment on YouTube. And I'll do my best to get back to you. Thank you for joining me today on this hot, smoky day here in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia, Canada. I live about 60 miles or 100 kilometers east of Vancouver. Once again, for the second year in a row, our province is undergoing a really bad wildfire season. And basically, the whole province is covered in smoke. Not just from fires within our own province, but also from our neighboring province, Alberta, and from the United States to the south of us. I woke up this morning, couldn't see the mountains. The sun was a red ball in the sky, and it's basically been smoky all day. So I've got the windows all closed. Makes for a little bit of a stuffy house. On the other hand, pardon me, I think maybe the smoke has kept things a little bit cooler than predicted, simply because the sun can't break through all the smoke. It's late in the afternoon. My window here faces to the west, and I'm really not sure what the lighting will be like for this episode because the sun is definitely coming through in kind of a diffused way and casting kind of warm reddish shadows on the ground. So it's the best I can do. So if you are a new viewer, this episode's going to be a little bit different than my others. I've just returned from a 2-week road trip to Minneapolis, Minnesota with my younger sister, Janine. And so there'll be a lot of references to that in this episode, including a fairly lengthy segment at the end detailing what we did, and I'll share some video and photos with you. So if you're not interested, you can just say goodbye after the regular part of the episode, but if you are interested, then you can stick around for the end. Since it was a road trip, I did manage to get quite a bit of knitting done, as I suspected. So I do have one finished project, one nearly finished project, and work in progress. I have a couple of up-and-coming things to show you. I was lucky enough to visit a yarn shop during my travel, so I have some acquisitions to share with you. I'll also talk about what I've been reading, which is actually quite a bit. So I think that's everything. Yeah, so let's jump in, shall we? So my one finished project were socks that I showed you before I left. I had gotten a chunk of these done before I left, and they are what I'm calling my peacock socks. The yarn is from West Yorkshire Spinners. It's their signature 4-ply. This is number 851 peacock, and then I did a complimentary heels in 333 blue raspberry. So this is, I think, the third pair of socks now. I think I've done the it's called German short row heel on. And I'm quite liking the way it looks. I'm still working on kind of perfecting the join, but this one worked out pretty well. It's top down. Not all, but most of my plain stockinette socks are. Actually, most of my socks in general I do top down. It's just the method I prefer. So nothing outstanding about them, but they kept me company in the car, and I had been storing them in my little house on the prairie bag that I had made for myself before I left. And I actually finished the socks the day that we pulled into Minneapolis, and that's when the little house on the prairie leg of our journey was over, so it seemed kind of fitting. So then, of course, I immediately cast on a new pair of socks because I needed more plain knitting for the car. And this time I used a sock blank that I had bought last December, I think it was, or maybe it might have been for Black Friday sale from Fiber Nymph Dye Works anyway. And it was her Happenstance sock blank with sparkle in the Welcome to Whoville colorway. So this is what the sock blank looked like when I got it. Now I don't have very large feet. I'm about a size 6.5. I think that's American, Canadian. And so looking at the sock blank, I knew that if I were to just knit off the end of the sock blank, probably for 1 foot, I wouldn't even get close to the blue. And I really wanted the blue to show up in both socks. So what I did is I folded the sock blank so that I had about half of the blue at the crease. And I snipped the yarn, and then I wound off both sections of the sock blank and rewound one of them backwards so that I formed two balls of yarn with the blue in the middle and proceeded to knit from the inside of the ball out so that the socks would at least somewhat resemble each other and both contain some of the blue yarn. So I've actually got quite a bit of done on these too, and you'll see that while they are not identical, which I didn't expect them to be, they are a sock blank, they do follow the same general pattern of the blue at the top and fading into these beautiful, or not fading, transitioning into this really fun multicolored area here, and then into a pink, more of a solid area here. And now we're getting some more fun colors happening. I did a yarn over short row heel on these. I kind of just reverted to my go-to because I didn't have the instructions for the German short row heel with me, and I just decided, I was in the car at the time, I was just going to do something that was more familiar. So that's how the first one looks. And then the solid, more or less solid pink is happening a little bit further down the foot rather than at the instep like the other one. But as you can see, they do resemble each other a fair bit, and they're going to make a really pretty and fun pair of socks, especially with the sparkle in them. So I've been dying to break into this. I was going to wait until closer to Christmas to knit my Christmas yarn, and then I thought, well, why? And now for sure I'll have another pair of Christmas socks to wear this year. So these have been really fun to work on. And then I have one more project that I worked on a lot in the car. And I think I talked about this before I left, but I hadn't cast it on. So this is the Wick Shawl by Helen Stewart. And this is the third shawl in the Shawl Society 2 collection, inspired by The Secret Garden. So I had a lot of fun looking at my stash yarns and coming up with a combination that I liked. So I did cast this on, I think a day or two before I think a day before I left for holidays, because I wanted to make sure I was actually going to like it at the way it was knitting up. So I cheated a little bit. It wasn't an entirely a road trip project, but pretty well. So the yarn I chose for color A is this really pretty yellow goldy yarn with speckles that I bought last summer in Carnation, Washington, where, I'm trying to remember the name of the shop. I actually have the bag right there because I never threw it away. I wanted to keep it. I think it's Tolt Yarns. I'll add it here if it's not. Anyway, this is called Farmer's Daughter Fibers. The yarn is Rocky Mountain Pearls in the Spring Fever colorway. So that's color A. Now I had teamed it up with this color of Louette Gems Fingering, which is grape. I had looked at these two yarns together a number of times and thought that they would make a nice 2-color shawl. But in looking through my stash, I came across this skein of Madeline Tosh Merino Light in the Margot colorway that I'd received as a gift from my sister a number of years ago. And I realized that the three together could make a really nice combination. And so I chose this for color B and this for color C, which is the, color C is only in the edging part of the shawl. So I'm actually basically ready to bind off. I've done everything but the bind off. And what's making me hesitate is that I have these beads that I've had left over from a project. I'm not sure how well the color is going to show up here. But they have this purpley, I'm going to put them in my hand to see if that helps. Try and put them in my hand, that is. See, I'm going to hold that up to the camera and see if that catches. They're probably just going to fall out. Anyway, they have a kind of a purpley tone with this golden tone, very similar to the colors in the yarns. And I was thinking of a way I might incorporate them into the shawl. So I'll show you the shawl, and then I'll talk about what I thought about doing and tell you what I'm not sure. I'm not sure what I'm going to do. So here's the shawl. So you can see it starts with color A, blends into color B there, and then there's some striping with color A and color B. That takes place later. And then color C comes in at the end. A little bit of lace. Let's see if I can, there you go. And then basically just an edging. Now the pattern is meant to just bind off with a straight edge. But I am tempted to add a little something on the end, maybe a picot edge of some sort, or a perhaps a scalloped edge, and incorporate these beads somehow. I did consider putting them in this lacy part. Now, when I did this part, I was on the road and my beads were at home, and so I had gone ahead and started this section on the road. And when I got home, I think I was about here, and I considered ripping it back and putting the beads on these stitches that run vertically in this little section. Thankfully, before I ripped everything back, I tried incorporating a couple of beads into the knitting just to see how they would look with this yarn, and I found that they really didn't show up very well because they were too similar to this color. So my thought is to perhaps add a little bit of this color A on the edge and incorporate a bead, say at a picot or at a scalloped point. I don't know how that will work or how it will look. It might ruin the overall effect of the shawl if I add that yellow right at the end. And I'm also just not sure how much the beads will show up in any case. So that is definitely, the end of this project is up for consideration. Again, just show you an idea of how it looks. So stay tuned till I make a decision. It's too bad my needles really don't incorporate this well. I'm going to try again to spread out the stitches just so you can get a real sense of this V area. Does that work any better? A little better. So there you go. I do love how these colors work together, and I thoroughly enjoyed working on it and seeing the colors knit up together. It was a great project for the car because it's mainly garter stitch, and even that little bit of lace I found I could work on without any difficulty while we were driving. So yeah, it worked out really, really well. I'm very happy with it. So yeah, I'll decide. I may just end up just binding it off as instructed, and it might just look, have that plain edge. We'll see. I'll Probably surprised myself as much as you. Let's see now. For up and coming, while I was away, the fourth pattern for the Handmade Sock Society by Helen Stewart became available. It's called the Honeybee Dance Socks with this really nice kind of textured pattern. And I immediately thought of this yarn that I had gotten as a Christmas present from my son. It is from Black Cat Custom Yarns here in Chilliwack, British Columbia. And it was the January color for the their sock yarn club. So my son had given that to me for Christmas. And it's called Champagne. It's an everyday sock. So I thought that would make, the yarn would show off that textured pattern really well, and I like that nice golden yellow. So very excited about casting on this new project pretty soon, I would think. And let's see where I can put this. Always a balancing act. And then I had Janine, my road trip partner, pick out a skein of yarn for me to make a shawl for her. She did 99.9% of the driving. She prefers to drive. I prefer to be a passenger and knit. And I think I drove for about an hour the first day, and after that I didn't drive again. She knew full well that if she wanted me to take over, I would, but she gets really bored when she's just a passenger, and so I was happy with that arrangement. She didn't seem to mind. So anyway, I said, pick out a skein of yarn, I'm going to knit you a shawl. As a thank you for the wear and tear on your car and the driving. And so this is Malabrigo Machita in the Aniversario colorway, so anniversary in Spanish. And we looked at Ravelry one night in the hotel room, and she picked out this caramel frappe shawl. And that is by, I have it written down here, Monica Cerna. So there's another look at it there. So I'm very excited to be casting that one on soon. I might even do that this evening while I contemplate what's going to happen with the wick shawl. So that's it for the knitting. It seems like a good time. I might as well show you my acquisition. Before we left for our road trip, I had mentioned to Janine that I have a tradition of stopping at trying to scope out yarn shops whenever my husband and I travel, and doing a little souvenir yarn shopping if possible. So she was all over that, and said she didn't mind whatsoever. So while we were in Minneapolis, she drove me over to Stephen B's. That I'm sure a lot of you have heard of that shop. It's one I've heard of through various podcasts, and so I decided that was the place I had to be. I didn't even bother looking up any other shops in Minneapolis, but apparently there are quite a few. One thing I was really wanting to get, I knew they had a good selection of hedgehog fibers, so I thought it would be a fitting yarn to look for, and so I wanted to see if I could find 3 that would make a good fade. Probably to do another sweater out of, or possibly a shawl. So I came up with these 3 skeins after much looking and trying out various combinations. So this is the sock yarn. This is Vengeance, this one. Just gorgeous, gorgeous colors. And this one is called Truffle. And then this one, I think you must say it, oh, it's Malice. You know, it's funny because I read it totally different when I was doing up show notes. And I had it as, I thought it was M-A-U-C-E, but it's actually L-I-C-E. I don't even have my glasses on and I read it better. So again, those are the 3 together. So I can't wait to figure out what I'm going to do with those and cast them on. And then I also picked up this skein of sock yarn from a dyer I'd never heard of before. It's called In the Deep Hue Sea. I guess the name is cut off partly by the price tag. There you go. And it's in the Godric colorway, which I understand is a Gryffindor Harry Potter reference. And so I just like it because I love red and I love yellow, and I've got them both here. So this is going to be a pair of socks for me at some point. And then I hit the clearance area. They had a big sale area, and I picked up this really pretty gradient. Colors are actually not too bad on camera. Reds and purples can be hard to capture. This is from Zen Yarn Garden, which is not a new to me dyer, but I just couldn't resist the colorways. So this is a gradient trio in Blossom Time. I mean, it was $20. How could I pass that up? Make a gorgeous, gorgeous shawl. And then I wanted something that was exclusive to, or from Minneapolis. Or what I've discovered is that Stephen B has some colorways that are exclusive to the shop. And so I found this 3 Irish Girls Adorn Luxe in the Electric Peacock colorway, and decided that that was going to be my Minneapolis / Stephen B yarn. So again, most likely a pair of socks. So yeah, and then along with the yarn for Janine, that was a pretty good haul. And when I was at the till, the clerk asked me if I wanted a bag, and I did not expect to get this bag. I don't know if you can tell, it's like copper lame. Stephen B made me do it. Apparently I'd reached the threshold to earn a bag. So I was very happy to walk out of the store with that. It was a very fun shop to look around in. Janine made herself comfortable on a bench and very patiently allowed me to just walk around and look at all the different yarns. And then we had a lot of fun picking out the yarn for her shawl together. So yeah, great morning. Let's move on to what I'm reading. So when I spoke to you last, I was busily trying to read my way through my Betsy Tacy books before the Betsy Tacy convention began. And I managed to finish the last book, Betsy's Wedding, the night, I think it was the night before the conference started, or maybe it was the night before that. In any case, I met my deadline, and so I had the storyline well refreshed before everything Betsy Tacy began. During the Betsy Tacy conference, 2 of our speakers were Kathleen Baxter and her friend Gretchen Hintz-Ronka. And as college students, they discovered that they and a couple of other friends were all fans of the Betsy Tacy series by Maud Hart Lovelace. And they realized that, or suspected that, a lot of the series was based on the author's real life. She grew up in Mankato, Minnesota, which is called Deep Valley in the books. And so they began a bit of a research journey into all things Betsy Tacy, and they were able to meet with a couple of the author's friends who are characters in the book, and they also corresponded with the author herself, and they made a couple of trips to Mankato to check out all things Betsy Tacy. And that was back in the 60s, but Kathleen Baxter has recently published a book called My Betsy Tacy Miracle, A Literary Pilgrimage to Deep Valley. And so I purchased that after her talk and read that. It's not very long. Read it through the other night, and it was really neat. It's full of lots of photographs of the different homes that are featured in the book, and different buildings, libraries, etc., and then also pictures of their various road trips. And also includes some letters from the different people that they corresponded with and such. So it was a really good read after having experienced my own trip to Mankato and having learned a lot more about the real life side of those books on which they were based. So that was a really good little read. Our trip to Minneapolis took us through the states of Washington, Idaho, Montana, South Dakota before reaching Minneapolis. And then on our return trip, we went a little bit further north. We went through North Dakota and before going through Montana and Idaho, and then into British Columbia, further west from where we had entered, or further east, I should say. And so I found this book in a bookstore. I think it was in Keystone, South Dakota, and it is about women's diaries from the westward journeys that they took as part of wagon trains in the mid-1800s to settle the West. It is by Lillian Schlissel. Hard to read. It's been a really interesting read. I've just finished all of the preamble where she takes different aspects of the diaries and discusses them in terms of similarities and differences that women experienced along the trail. And then the last part of the book, about I guess a little more than halfway through, are the actual diaries, some of the actual diaries that the accounts are based on. And so I'm looking forward to delving into the actual writings of the women, other than just quotations that are included in the beginning part. I was a history major. I've always been very interested in the whole Oregon Trail experience, and this is just another aspect of it. Another area of interest that I've had for a long time is the Lewis and Clark expedition and Corps of Discovery, and I've read a number of nonfiction and fiction books about it. And I picked up this book at Mount Rushmore about Sacagawea. I didn't realize at the time it was originally printed in 69, and I don't, other than the forwards, I don't think it's been revised very much. And I believe that there is some research that's been done since this time that may come to raise some different conclusions about what happened to Sacagawea after the Lewis and Clark expedition, but I am enjoying it so far. It's pretty simply written, and so far it's just outlining, more or less just outlining the events of the expedition. But we found ourselves along this trip in some points sort of following in the footsteps of the expedition, both on their journey west and the return journey east. So that was really cool too, to get a sense of the type of country that the expedition went through. So enjoying that since I got home. Now that I've been to some of the places where Laura Ingalls Wilder grew up, I am really anxious to get back to my Little House on the Prairie books and start reading some of those again. I've read them many times, but now when I read them, I'm going to see them with a new eye, because I can definitely envision some of the places that are described in the books. So that is probably a good place to leave the regular segment of this week's podcast. If you are not interested in hearing all the details of my 2-week journey, then I will say goodbye now, and I hope you'll join me next time, probably in about a week's time, for a more regular podcast. And if you are interested, then stick around, and I will put together an account of our trip, and hopefully you'll enjoy that. So stay tuned. kind of struggling with how to put together an account of my trip. I originally thought I would do a separate little episode, and I started to put together some little video clips and photos. But I realized that partway through the trip, I was going to have to jump in with some narration to make some of the photos and videos make sense. And so I decided to include it as part of this regular episode. So just to give you an overview of where I went and why I went, last summer my sister Janine asked me if I would be interested in attending the Betsy Tacy convention in Minneapolis, Minnesota from August 3rd to 5th of this year. And Betsy Tacy, for those who may not know, is a series of books written by Maud Hart Lovelace, a Minnesota native. She grew up in a small town named Mankato, and in her books she calls it Deep Valley. And the series basically includes many aspects of her own life from age 5 up until the time that she got married. And these books were in our home growing up. Our older sisters read them, and I think that's how Janine and we really can't remember the first book that we read and when that would have been, but it was something definitely that we were introduced to by our older sisters. Probably Janine remembers seeing a library book lying on one of our sisters' beds, and she said that's probably how she became aware of them. So the books were reprinted in year 2000, I believe it was, and I bought the whole series and reread them, including a couple of books involving peripheral characters that I don't know if I had actually read when I first read the series. So that was one purpose of the trip. But a greater purpose for myself was to visit some of the sites where Laura Ingalls Wilder grew up. More so than Maud Hart Lovelace, I have been a huge fan of Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie series right from being a kid. The first book I read was On the Banks of Plum Creek, and at some point I realized that the author and the main character had the same name, and kind of put two and two together and realized that this series was at least partially based on the author's life. And Janine also has been a huge Little House fan for many years, and both of us, besides reading the fiction, also have read a lot of nonfiction works about the author. And we talked about how one day we would do a Laura Ingalls Wilder road trip together and visit some of the sites. So when she told me about the conference, she said, and we can do our Little House sites on the way. Now, we originally had more ambitious plans. We thought that we might also go south into Mansfield, Missouri, which is where Laura Ingalls Wilder lived actually most of her life. She and her husband moved there the decade after they were married and settled there and lived out their lives. But this time it just wasn't in the cards. We couldn't afford either the time or the expense. And so we satisfied ourselves with visiting De Smet, where Laura spent her teenage years and the early years of her marriage. And then a little bit further east, on our way to Minneapolis, we passed through Walnut Grove, which is where On the Banks of Plum Creek is set, and also where the TV series was set. And so although we didn't get to visit Little House in the Big Woods of Wisconsin, or the Little House on the Prairie in Kansas, or Laura Ingalls Wilder's home in Mansfield, Missouri, we did very much enjoy the time that we spent in De Smet and Walnut Grove. So we left our home here in Chilliwack Saturday morning, July 28th. It was my husband's and my 34th anniversary, and he very kindly didn't hold it against me that I was leaving him on such a special day. He was playing in a ball tournament that weekend, so he actually left the house before I did to go get to the ball field in time for their first game. And then Janine came and picked me up, and we crossed the border without any difficulty whatsoever. From there, we head across Washington. I'm trying to think what order they come in. Idaho, Montana, South Dakota before we reached Minneapolis. For the most part, we were just driving to get there. De Smet was supposed to be our first area that we were doing any tours. But as you'll see in the following clips, we did do a little more sightseeing on the way. So meet Janine. This is my sister. Little sister. We have just crossed the border into the U.S., filled up with gas at Sumas, Washington, and we are on our way to Minnesota. Minnesota, here we come. Yay. So it's the morning of day 2. We had our first adventure last night.
Yes, we did.
Would you like to tell us about it, Janine?
Oh, sure. We'd done our bookings through booking.com, and we picked the historic Brooks Hotel in historic Wallace, Idaho, and we came in about 8:30.
Yeah, something like that.
It was late, and they said, we don't have a room for you.
And all the hotels in town are already full, and then they said, we've been working out a solution for you, and they had an apartment that was attached to the hotel somehow that was temporarily vacant, but it had recently been exited by the tenants, and they trashed it, so they've been in the process of cleaning it up for us. So it wasn't the fanciest room, but it was clean.
It was somewhere to sleep.
And somewhere to sleep. So neither of us had a really great sleep. So we're up early this morning and heading to our next destination, which is Billings, Montana. Yes. So we had a lovely day yesterday.
Oh, gorgeous.
Except for that. We had a great day of driving and dinner at Red Lobster, which we've been planning for a few days.
Yeah, it was good.
It was great. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, check it in later on.
7:45.
Yeah, here we go. Billings, here we come. So we've just arrived at our accommodation for tonight. It's day 3. We are near Mount Rushmore. And look where we get to stay tonight. It's like a little, almost like a little cabin with the little stairs. And it's really cute inside. Sit on. You can hear the traffic in the background, and somebody's weed eating. Look how nice. Kind of like a little cabin. You can see picture Mount Rushmore there. And even the bathroom's pretty. So we had a really nice day yesterday. We left Wallace, Idaho. I never remember where it is. After not such a great night, but we had a beautiful day, beautiful drive through various mountain ranges, including the Rockies yesterday.
Lots of rivers.
Yeah, we followed the Clark Fork a long ways, and it was right side of the road. Yeah, it was great. Sort of followed in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark a little bit from their return journey from Oregon, the mouth of the Columbia. And then we were very happy to arrive at our hotel last night and find they actually had a reservation for us. And so we got in, went and had some nice dinner, and settled in for a nice quiet
glass of wine.
Glass of wine, maybe 2. And then got up this morning. I think we left by just after 8, quarter after 8. Got back on the road and drove some beautiful prairie landscape and through the Black Hills to get here to Keystone near Mount Rushmore. So yeah, looking forward to seeing this area. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we're just going to get settled in here, and then we're going to head out to see Mount Rushmore and also check out the Keystone Museum, where they have some Carrie Ingalls memorabilia. She used to live here in Keystone.
Yes.
That's Laura Ingalls Wilder's sister. So yes, we'll take some video over at Rushmore, of course.
Yes.
Hey, it's day 4, July 31st. We're in Custer State Park. We had a very nice visit to Mount Rushmore last night and saw like a film and they lit up the mountain. And we also went and saw the museum in Keystone and saw stuff on Carrie Ingalls. So today is, we're traveling to De Smet and we're going to stay there 2 nights. So today is our...
It's our journey day.
Yes, our journey day, we've been calling it.
We're not worried about the destination, it's getting there on the way.
So we're actually almost backtracking and going through Custer State Park in the hopes of seeing some buffalo on the wildlife loop. So we're just on a lookout right now and heading that way. And then we're also going to do a detour through the Badlands. So should have some pictures from that later.
Oh, you can see Mount Rushmore right through there.
Oh, is that ever cool? Look at that, Mount Rushmore. Now, isn't that neat? So our journey day ended up being quite a bit longer than either of us had anticipated. Because of one thing or another, we did not reach De Smet until 10:15 that evening. We're pretty tired, needless to say, but thrilled to be in Laura's former home. We're happy to check into our hotel, happier still that they had our reservation because they'd actually had quite a bit of trouble with their online booking system and had many unhappy people that week, though in the week prior, because they simply didn't have the reservation. So we were very lucky. We settled in and got all rested, ready for the next day in which we were going to do all things Laura Ingalls Wilder. So after breakfast in our hotel, we drove over to the Memorial Society. Besides the building that they have the gift shop and museum in, on site, they also have several buildings that they will tour you through. So the first of these is the Surveyor's House, which has been moved from its former location. And this is the first house that Laura lived in and her family lived in over the winter of 1879 and 80. So these, the accounts of that time are included in By the Shores of Silver Lake. And after that, we got to tour the original schoolhouse that Laura and her sisters had attended in De Smet. And it too has been moved from its former location. And it used to be, had been turned into a house at one point. So it's been restored, and it's actually really interesting because they've peeled back all sorts of layers of wallpaper and such, and found the original blackboard behind. And so they've preserved that under glass so you can see some writing on the blackboard that was still there. There's a drawing of a little boat, little sailboat. So the desks and such that are in the schoolhouse are not the original, but they are similar to what Laura and her and the other students would have sat in, except that they were, I think there might be one row, if I remember right, there's one row of double seats, but I think all of them at one time were double seats. And those of you who've read the books might remember the whole rocking the seat incident that happens with Eliza Jane Wilder as the teacher. Tries to get Carrie to rock the seat, and Laura takes over and gets pretty mad, and they get sent home from school. In the back of the schoolhouse were several coffee grinders and some wheat, and you're encouraged to try and grind wheat into flour, which is what the family subsisted on, bread made from wheat flour ground in coffee grinders during the long winter, which is, I think that was 1880 to 81, if I'm not mistaken. And it's really not easy. They used to pass around this coffee grinder all day, and it's pretty tough work, I have to say. I gave it a shot. And then also there's examples of twisted hay that the family, they didn't have any wood left, and so they were burning hay for fuel. And it's sort of like you would find like probably a similar process to twisting up a skein of yarn, and about the same size, maybe a little bit bigger. And 3 of these twists of hay took 15 minutes to burn. So you can imagine how many hay bundles they had to twist every day in order to stay warm and not freeze. Also on site was a recreation of the Brewster School, which was the first school that Laura taught in. That's, I believe, I think that's accounted in these happy golden years, if I'm not mistaken. It's actually the Bushy School in real life, and that was the name of the real family. The school was just an old claim shanty. You realize just how small those buildings were. But it was quite neat to go in and imagine what Laura's first school might have looked like. After touring the Brewster School, we all got into our cars and drove over to the house in town that Pa had built. After they left their claim shanty, Mom and Pa moved into a house in town. And while Laura didn't live there, she certainly would have visited it often before she moved away from De Smet. And I know that she also came back and visited her father shortly before he passed away. It was parts of the house, in particular the parlor, are decorated much as they would have been when the family lived there. The parlor, there's a picture of Ma in the parlor, and a lot of the wallpaper, etc., are based on items in the photograph. So it's kind of neat to see how it, would have looked at that time. And then after we toured the townhouse, we also drove around town, drove down Main Street, and had a sense, or Calumet Avenue, and had a map provided that pointed out various landmarks that would have been mentioned in the books set in De Smet. I'm not sure if there were any original buildings left. Saw the location of Pa's store where the family spent the long winter, but it is not the original building anymore. But it was kind of neat to get a sense of space and location. The street's very wide, as many of these towns of that era are, because they had to be able to turn a horse and buggy around in the street, etc. So have room for hitching posts, all those things. So it was really neat. And then came the best part of the day. First we drove out towards Silver Lake, which unfortunately no longer exists. There's just basically a stand of prairie there. And just beyond that is the original Ingalls homestead. And there are 5 of the 6 cottonwoods that they planted when they first moved to their claim, as described at the end of By the Shores of Silver Lake. And stood on the homestead and could look out over the big slough and towards town, which is only about a mile away, and got a real thrill, literally standing in Loringos Wilder's footsteps. Looking at a view that, though it's changed in some ways, probably is quite similar to how it was when she lived there. The site is owned by the Loringos Wilder Memorial Society, and they have a cairn. They are marking the site of the homestead. The rest of the homestead is owned privately and is set up as a tourist attraction for people to enjoy pioneer experiences. So while it is not specifically aimed, it doesn't contain specific Loringos Wilder artifacts or anything like that, it's still a really neat place to, if you wanted to experience some of the pioneer activities. We didn't take part in that. We just took a quick look through the gift shop. But when my sister Janine and her husband Joe came through this area in 2012, they had camped there on the homestead property, so they thought that was pretty cool. So yeah, I'm going to include the footage here. There's a lot of wind blowing, so where necessary, I've printed on the screen what I think I was saying, but it'll give you a sense of our experience there. Listen, can you hear the wind in the trees? I'm standing on the spot of the original Ingalls homestead in Dismet, South Dakota. And to the left and right of me are 5 of the original 6 trees that were planted by the Ingalls family when they put their claim shanty up here on this piece of property. And behind me, the Loringos Wilder Memorial Society has erected that cairn. So this is the view that Laura and her family would have had looking towards town, and right directly in front of them. Where their house would have stood, and listening to the breeze blow through the same conduit that she would have listened to many wonderful. Picking up coming here for so many years, just very thrilled to finally. So here's the view from the opposite direction. This is where the front of the claim shanty would have been, the entranceway, and then the cottonwoods on either side. So after we left the homestead, we took a drive out to Lakes Henry and Thompson as following it once again in Loris and her husband Almanzo's footsteps. When they were courting, they would take buggy rides out in this direction, as described in these Happy Golden Years. And as Laura describes, all that separates the two lakes is just a narrow strip of land wide enough for a road. So again, it was just really cool to be able to envision, at least to a degree, what this area would have looked like. Of course, it's been modernized. There's a lot more buildings and such in between Dismet and where the lakes are located. And Lake Thompson is a recreational area, but still, it was really neat. And then we drove out to where Laura and Almanzo's first homestead was, and where their daughter Rose Wilder, who later became an author herself, Rose Wilder Lane, that's where she was born. So there's a sign that marks the spot, but you could just look up a little hill. That's about all you can see from the original homestead. And then we drove a little bit further on to their original tree claim. There is a airport there called Wilder Field, and we are guessing that the few cottonwoods that are left in this field are ones that Almanzo would have planted for his tree claim. So after we left the tree claim, we drove back into town and visited the cemetery where Pa, Ma, Mary, Carrie, and Grace and her husband are all buried, as is the young infant son of Almanzo and Laura. And we also, on the back of our map, there was a little map of the cemetery that also pointed out some of the graves of well-known characters from the Little House books, like Mr. and Mrs. Boast, Reverend and Mrs. Brown, some of the shop owners. So it was fun to look around the cemetery and see some familiar names there too. After getting some dinner, Janine and I drove out to the homesteads again so that we could see it by sunset. This is a scene that's often described in the books. Laura and her blind sister Mary would often take a walk after dinner, and Laura would describe the countryside to her sister as they walked, including the incredible sunsets. And so this would have been a very familiar sight to Laura, and it was just a very special way to end a very special day. The next morning, we made our way to Minneapolis, but we made a stop at Walnut Grove along the way. Walnut Grove is a town that is featured on the banks of Plum Creek, and it is also the setting for the television series Little House on the Prairie. The entire series is set there, even though the Ingalls family only lived there for a short time. On the banks of Plum Creek, there is a story about how Pa donated some money for a church bell, and that was true. He did so. And the bell still hangs in one of the church towers in town, and so we located that, got to look at Pa's bell, and then we drove out to the site of the dugout that Laura and her family lived in when they first arrived on the banks of Plum Creek. So it's really amazing. The owners of that site allow the public to tour the site. You drive through their yard, and you leave $5 in a box, and you drive to the dugout site right along the creek. It's amazing. So when Janine and her husband Joe had made this trip in 2012, they had the whole place to themselves. And Janine was so hoping the same would be true for us, and it was. So it was really, really amazing to walk along the creek and see the site of the dugout.
So here we are on the banks of Plum Creek, and directly in front of us is the site of the dugout, marked there with the sign. Very peaceful here. Janine and I are by ourselves. There's no one else around, and we're just enjoying walking along the creek and listening to the sound of birdsong and cicadas. There's dragonflies flying everywhere. It is so beautiful and peaceful and such a lovely sunny day.
The owners have turned about 20 acres back into prairie, and they have a couple of different trails that you can walk, loop trails. So we did one that took us along a cornfield, and we could see the tableland that Laura describes in her book. and then make our way back to the dugout site where we both dipped our toes into Plum Creek.
Hi, Janine.
Hello.
Here's Janine dipping her toes into Plum Creek.
Very cold.
It's been actually quite high lately, and this site was closed, I think, a week or so ago.
A few weeks ago, yeah.
So we're lucky to have it open.
When I was here, I was able to walk across. I waded all the way across.
Oh, that would be so neat.
But I wouldn't do it today.
This is right across from the dugout site over there. I just took a little slide down the creek bed, so I'm going to have to change my shorts when I get back to the car. But I'm going to try and sit on that rock, take a little dip in the creek myself. I'm taking my turn, dipping my feet. You can see my dirty elbow from sliding down the creek bed. It is cold, but it feels really fun to be able to dip my own feet. Where Laura waded so many times as a child. It's a beautiful spot. It's too bad we can't stay longer.
Then it was time to head to Minneapolis and all things Betsy Tacy. So the conference itself did not begin until the afternoon of Friday, August 3rd, but Janine and I arrived in town late Thursday afternoon. Now, Janine has been a member of a Maud Hart Loveless listserv, I think, since the late 90s. She's also a member of a Facebook group, and she's attended 2 prior conventions. So she knows a lot of people, some only online, but many she's met in person before. So one of the local members had invited early arrivals, people who were arriving early, and also some other local people to her home for dinner Thursday night as kind of a pre-conference get-together. So I was very lucky to be included in that. It was amazing. Her husband grilled steak and chicken and fish and vegetables. They provided tortillas, homemade guacamole to make fajitas, wine and other drinks, soft drinks. It was amazing hospitality. There were about 20 of us there, and it was great because I got a chance to meet some people before the conference had started. While I've grown up with the Betsy Tacy books and I'm familiar with the characters and the locations, I'm just not part of that whole Betsy Tacy world the way Janine is. So it was a really nice foray into it. So I met a knitter. Yes, there's a knitting connection. And I'll talk about her more later. The next morning is when we made our trip to the yarn shop, which I've outlined in the earlier part of this podcast. Then we came back to the hotel and had lunch with some of the other conference attendees. The conference itself kicked off at 3 o'clock that afternoon with a bus tour of some local Minneapolis sites that were featured in the final book of the series, Betsy's Wedding. So we went to the cemetery where the author's parents are buried, and also to a park where there is a plaque mounted commemorating the spot of the Loveless home to which Betsy and her family moved after Betsy finished high school in Mankato. We also got to see some of the homes of the characters that were featured in the book, and also I think the highlight for everyone was to go tour the Bow Street apartment where Betsy and Joe spend their early married life. So it was very graciously opened up to all of us, which I think we numbered somewhere between 120 and 140 people. If you can imagine, this young man let us all troop through his little apartment to see the window that Betsy / Maud looked out into a maple tree as she would write. And it was just something, again, just something about following in those footsteps was really, really cool. This is the apartment from the outside, and then you can see the bow window on the second story is where the apartment was located. And then we came back to the hotel, and they had a kind of a appies for dinner and a speaker that evening. So that concluded the first day of the convention. The next day was the big day. We had another bus, got on the bus again, and drove to Mankato, or aka Deep Valley, which is where the vast majority of the Betsy Tacy series is set. And I think the highlight there, without a doubt, was seeing Betsy's and Tacy's original homes. That was the series opens with Betsy living in this little yellow cottage, and across the street, the Kelly family moves in, and she meets Tacy, becomes her best friend forever. So that was really, really special to see those homes. Just down the street and around the corner, we found Tib's house. It's not quite as described in the books, but it's chocolate covered, just as described. We also saw the home, not very far away, where Betsy or Maud Hart Lovelace had actually been born before her family moved up to the little yellow cottage. Although the original bench does not still stand, in its place is a bench where we posed. Betsy and Tacy often would meet at the bench and plan their adventures together, or sit there and eat their dinner and look down the hills. So it was really exciting to be in that location too. And then after a picnic, we toured just drove around town, saw some sites where some of the characters in the series had lived. We also visited the Mankato Library, where some of the artifacts belonging to Maud and her family are located. And also there are some original drawings by Lois Lenski that were featured in the books. My favorite is the overview of Deep Valley, the map. So that shows the big hill where they used to go exploring and where their houses were located, etc. And then we visited the site of the old Carnegie Library, where Betsy as the character and Maud as the author used to visit frequently, and there's even the desk is still there that the character librarian Miss Sparrow would have stood behind. So it's a pretty special place too. From there we drove to Little Syria, which is described in the books, and looked up the other side of the big hill, which was featured in Betsy and Tacy Go Over the Big Hill. So it was kind of neat to see that too. Then it was time to go back to Minneapolis, where we had a beautiful dinner and some more speakers. And then the next morning we had brunch and our final speakers. So there was another knitting connection during this conference. When Janine and I were at home and planning it, we were looking at the itinerary, and I noticed that one of the talks was being given by the organizer Josephine Wolf and her mother Perry Class. And I said to Janine, there's a woman named Perry Class that used to write for Knitters Magazine. And I went and grabbed this magazine, this issue I have from fall of 2010, and found her column and showed Janine the picture, and she said, yes, that's the same person. She'd met her before. So that was kind of neat. So Josephine and Perry gave a talk called Stories About Girls Who Want Curly Hair for Girls Who Want Straight Hair. So as a curly-haired person, I totally can relate to that. I've always wanted a nice straight page boy. And both Perry and Josephine have very curly hair. So they went on to talk about how they themselves tried to straighten their hair over the years, because that's almost always been the trend is straight hair. But Betsy, who has straight hair through the whole teenage years and adult years goes to great lengths to curl her straight hair. And they talked about different tools of the time that would have been used to curl hair, including curling tongs that you would heat up on the stove. And in one incident, Betsy basically burns her hair off and creates bangs. So that was a really enjoyable talk. So as I alluded to, the first evening we were in Minneapolis, and we were actually in St. Paul, which is where the dinner was held. I met Linda, who was wearing a beautiful beaded shawl, and I admired it and asked her if she had knit it, and she had, and I told her I was a knitter too, and so we had a discussion about knitting and yarn shops, and she said, "Are you going to visit Stephen B?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "If you're still around after the conference, you should come to my house and see my yarn room." And the next, or I think a couple days later, she approached me again and said, "I'm really serious about that." And she said, "Why don't you and Janine come and have supper with my husband and I?" And so what happened is Janine wanted to attend church, so she dropped me off at Linda's place, and she went off to church, and then she came back and had supper. So Linda and I had a really nice time in her craft room, and finding we have a lot of preferences in common in yarn and knitting podcasts and things like that. So Linda, if you're watching, hello. It was so nice to meet you. Thank you so much again for your hospitality, and I hope to get to know you better via Ravelry. So that was a really nice way for both of us. We really enjoyed speaking with Linda and her husband Steve, and touring parts of their beautiful home. They have an absolutely gorgeous library, complete with a secret door. It was just a lovely, lovely way to end our stay in Minneapolis. So yes, thank you once again, Linda, for just making us feel so welcome. I had thought that Janine already knew Linda in person, but she had recognized her name from online, but they never actually really interacted. So that was neat because Janine got to make a new friend too. I forgot to mention, before Janine and I went to Linda's, we drove over to see Minnehaha Falls. The falls are mentioned in the poem The Song of Hiawatha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and this poem and the falls play a role in Betsy and the Great World. So I had to see them for myself. Janine had seen them with her husband Joe previously in 2012, but she didn't mind going again. So yeah, they're quite beautiful, and another thing to check off my list. We also got to see the Mississippi River on our way, so that was kind of cool too. So once again, just our time in Minneapolis was just fantastic. Just can't get over how warm and welcoming all the Betsy Tacy people were. If I was at all worried, which I kind of was, about being out of place, that worry was soon put to rest, and it was really great to meet so many nice people and to just feel like a part of the experience. So it was great. Then it was time to head home. We had 4 long days of driving in front of us, so we wasted no time Monday morning getting up and getting on our way. So we left Minneapolis this morning. We're on our way home, and we just stopped for lunch at Chick-fil-A. We're eating our way across America, trying all these different American restaurants that we do not have at home. So Janine, you want to tell what happened?
Sure. Well,
so funny.
I had said to Carol, if we can spot a Chick-fil-A on the way, let's stop there for lunch, and she agreed. And we got to Moorhead, Minnesota, Fargo, North Dakota. The two cities just kind of blend, and didn't see anything on the sign. So we're getting near the end of town. We thought, well, we better pull over and check on my navigating thing here in the car to see if there are any restaurants nearby. And I scrolled through the list, no Chick-fil-A. Filtered it by name, no Chick-fil-A. So we decided on Panera Bread, which Carol hasn't had either. And
as we're driving here, I said, now wouldn't it be funny if right beside Panera Bread was a Chick-fil-A?
And if you could see right over there, there's Panera Bread, but behind us is a Chick-fil-A.
So
And it was very good.
It was
worth
very
it.
good. So now we're back in the car. Next stop is Dickinson, North Dakota, where we're sleeping tonight. So it's still a few
Quite a ways.
hours away. We get there around dinner time. So,
Maybe there will be a Panera Bread.
You never know. It's been a good drive so far. I have to tell you the story about the scenic viewpoint, and I'm kicking myself for not getting a picture of it. So Minnesota is known as the land of 10,000 lakes, and certainly as we made our way from Minneapolis to North Dakota, we passed numerous ponds and lakes on our way. And we spotted a sign that said Scenic Viewpoint, and Janine said, "Do you want to pull over there?" And it's like, sure. So we pulled over, and it literally was just a pull out on the road. And there was a sign for the Scenic Viewpoint, which was a lake, much like the many, many lakes we'd already passed on our way. So we weren't sure exactly what made this one a scenic viewpoint, but we had a good laugh about that on the way home. Another scenic viewpoint that was truly scenic was we passed part of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and it was at a rest area that overlooked the Badlands. Another section of Badlands, not the same ones we saw on the trip on coming. But we stayed there for a little while and took in the scenery. It really was beautiful. And in the parking lot, we had seen a sign about had a sign with a buffalo on it and warnings not to approach wild animals. And then we later read that buffalo and wild horses and antelope and deer, can't think of anything else, could all be spotted in that area. And sure enough, as we drove a little bit further on from the road, we saw a couple of buffalo and also some wild horses, which I've never seen before. So that was really, really neat. Other than that, our trip home was very uneventful. We pulled into Great Falls, Montana on our second to last night, just done. We ended up getting pizza and just eating in the hotel room. And again, we're off and running first thing in the morning. That morning we woke up to smoky skies, and we had smoky skies for the next 2 days all the way home. On our second to last day, we crossed the Rockies, which was really beautiful. Would have been even more beautiful without the smoke. And then late that afternoon, we crossed back into Canada in the eastern British Columbia. So even though we were still a full day's drive away from home, it felt like coming home. As much as we enjoyed our time in the United States, it just felt so good to be back in our own country and see some familiar business names and see kilometers instead of miles. That's one thing that I think kind of threw us both a little bit. When we are traveling on a highway and we see a destination as being about 100 kilometers away, we know it's going to take us about an hour to get there. But in the United States, you see 100 miles and it's more like about an hour and a half. I think that kind of, we both found that a little bit deceptive as we would make our way along. It always seemed to take longer to get somewhere than we were anticipating. So the final morning, we got up bright and early, had breakfast, and headed out for our last day's drive. It got broken up in a really nice way. Our sister Allison and her husband were holidaying about halfway between where we left and home. And so we stopped and had lunch with them and told them a little bit about our trip. Yeah, so it was a great little stop along the way, but we were raring to go. So got home about 6:15 that evening. Felt so good. There we are, entering Chilliwack! Woo!
Home!
Our road trip is coming to an end. We're going to be home in just a few minutes. A second here, we're going to come out onto the valley floor. There, here we come into the valley. It's smoky and it's hot. It's home. Yeah, 36 degrees. But yes, we're just about home. Be it ever so humble, there's no place like home.
And it was a good trip.
East and west, home is best.
That's right.
The door, and there was there were notes, letters spelling out a note leading the way up the stairs, and a vase of flowers and a lovely card waiting there from my husband. So he missed me. I'm never allowed to go away that long again, he said. I missed him too, and it's been as much fun as I had on our road trip, and do not regret going whatsoever. It is definitely good to be home. And on that note, I've rambled long enough. I hope you enjoyed the pictures and the videos, and I should see you hopefully in about a week's time, and catch up on all the knitting, etc. that I've done since then. So take care till then. Thank you so much for watching. It's so good to be back, and take care. See you soon. Bye.